It's been a really great event, and my task is to talk about the reading experience. And since I am not sitting on piles of data, which Michael is, which is really fascinating, I thought I would take a more personal approach, essentially. You know, the reading experience is so specific to the context, to the individual, to the life stage. My daughter, who's almost 3, her reading experience is completely different from her older sister's reading experience, which is completely different from my own. So I thought I'd kind of trace a little bit of my own experience through the years in digital media, reading in the browser, and sort of get to how we arrived to where we are. I think it's always useful to look back. I love history. It tends to show us things we didn't realize, and I think it can a little bit point the way forward. So without further ado, I want to start in 1996. That was 16 years ago, and two things were happening at that point, to me anyway. And some of you will probably remember these things. Many of you who were on the web might remember Feed, which is a company I co-founded. We were into our 18th month, and the germane facts about Feed were that we were publishing longish essays on the web starting in 1995. By 1996, we had done our first redesign, and there was something very specific we were trying to achieve. And that was, whenever we linked, we tried to give folks more information about where they were going, so they wouldn't just kind of go down the rabbit hole of the web, and they'd sort of have a preview. And with the redesign, we added even more information, and so that little quote talks about sort of what our readers were going to get. And here's a page, and the first thing you'll notice is how much text there was on that page. Kind of ugly. HTML was pretty crude language at the time. And what the quote was talking about was that left column there, in which there are sort of chunks of text to describe the links, and that little label, which sort of meaningless in a way, but we were trying to get at something about previewing what those links were headed towards. I will also note that though we were really mostly staying within 800 to 4,000 words in terms of what we were publishing, people would consistently tell us no one would read long stuff on the web. Just, they wouldn't do it. For 6 years, we proved them wrong. So the other thing that happened in 1996 was David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest came out. And I remember really clearly lugging the book home from the bookstore and reading it, and I would read it sort of in a crouch on my bed because that was the best way to flip back and forth from the body text to the endnotes. And if any of you've read it, you may or may not agree, but I felt that he put a lot of his best writing in the endnotes. So, and here's 2 stats. It was 1,079 pages, of which almost 100 of those pages were endnotes in that tiny little type. So I feel like the web circa 1996, 2 really key elements were not well or elegantly integrated, and that was a hyperlink and something like an endnote or a footnote. And so flash forward, 2004 to 2009, I am now writing my own book, and this is for those of you who do not recognize this subway map, you probably all do, for New York City. And I was living in Brooklyn, as I still do, and Columbia University has one of the best research libraries, and a lot of the material I needed to research for my own book was historical, so it was really a great place to go to do research. But though it's only 14 miles, it takes an hour on the subway, and I was pregnant twice during the writing of my book, because it took me forever to finish. So I was lucky because in 2004, Google Books launched. And this really totally transformed my research and writing experience. And in some ways, this was my first true browser and book experience. I think it was probably many people's. Really, you saw there were books, they looked like books, and there they were in a browser. And what was interesting was how I was consuming these books. I wasn't sitting down to read them cover to cover. I was scanning, I was surfing, I was looking for nuggets of information that was going to be useful. And I was also doing keyword searches. And that was useful, but also a little dangerous because a lot of the terms I was searching weren't standardized in terms of spelling. So to me, it was a really interesting lesson in the sort of limitations of, at the time, search in books in the browsers. So we're making headway here. 2008 to 2010. between those years, I think some of our habits really became sort of calcified or reified reading habits. They'd been building up, and we had sort of been acquiring a new set of reading habits, I believe, since 1996. But they really, by this period, they were really kind of firmly entrenched in our behavior. And a few of them are, this isn't exhaustive, but these are, to me, the really main ones, was that hyperlinks plus Google plus Wikipedia meant that you could be a click away from relevant information to whatever topic you're reading. So whether it was an essay or a news article or a bio, you knew if you wanted to know more, that was how fast you can get it. Flickr plus Google Image plus Tumblr meant that you were also equally close to visual information. And this actually is even some ways more radical or more recent insofar as if you think of the current state of the print book now, even today, visual information for adult trade books is almost non-existent. We're not talking about cookbooks or reference books. So, you have, and I was my book and my readers were a casualty of this, you have all of the images, if there are going to be any, kind of collected in this sort of insert of plates, nowhere near the context in which these images are referenced. And I remember when Keith Richards' memoir, Life, came out, hearing from numerous people that, and this was again in 2010, whenever they read a mention of Linda Keith, they really wanted to see what she looked like, and so they'd immediately go and Google her online and see a picture like this one. And it's kind of amazing how, given magazines, the existence of magazines for over a century, and now the web, how books have sort of persisted in this sort of visual scarcity. And then another kind of key trend was that between Google Maps, MapQuest, and geolocation, we expect to be able to locate any place mentioned in a book pretty immediately, pretty quickly, and also to be able to understand our own relationship to it. So of course, as everyone knows, the iPad arrives in 2010, and to me this removed one of the biggest barriers to reading books in browsers, not just scanning them or surfing them or mining them for information, and that was discomfort. It was just really not fun to sit at your desktop or even with a laptop. It's awkward and read a book in a web browser. But information design didn't immediately catch up. I think interactive designers were really used to designing for optimizing for page views, click-throughs, and display ads. So reading apps like the Kindle reading app were in some ways way ahead of the browser in terms of a really fully satisfying, even though it still lacks some stuff, reading experience. Flash forward to 2011, and we get to the Atavist and other sort of similar services which do a lot of what we do and to varying degrees. When I met the founders of the Atavist, I'm employee number one, I really had this aha moment, because I really felt like they achieved in an app, and we'll get to the browser part in a moment, what I and the co-founder of Feed, Stephen Johnson, had been striving to do in the mid-90s. And that was sort of intelligently display information contextually that was relevant. So endnotes can essentially be accessed or ignored as you're reading. And the same with photos. They can be placed inline, they can be placed in a sort of pop-up, they can be placed in between sections. And that's true of all the other media types, maps, rich media, videos, audio. And this really, it seems kind of simple and obvious, but it actually was a big advance. So it combined the best, I felt, of print in terms of a really clearly immersive reading experience that you could hold in your lap and really dive into and not be distracted in the way that a web page is constantly kind of blaring at you, but also allowed you to dive into that extra information at will and take those sort of side trips when you wanted to. So now in 2012, what we have through Atavist and other similar services, I know there's Story Planet launching, I think Pressbooks does some of this for sure, and Vook, is really that experience brought to the browser. We launched stories in the browser with our last story, The Stowaway, which was actually a comic nonfiction story about an Ethiopian refugee. And so now we've merged what started in the app experience that sort of clarified reading into the browser. So in a way, we had to kind of leave the browser to come back to it and deliver what I feel like answers and builds on the habits that we've developed over these last 10 or 20 years. Habits that, again, are so natural to us, we forget how weird it is to expect to see a photograph right next to the text that we're reading in a book-like experience. I'll just add, so we're about to hit 2013. Of course, the big news is the mini iPad is here. And I think I agree with Hugh in a couple of ways that the sort of distinction between browsers and apps and what a book is and how it explodes and a book just becomes part of the internet is definitely happening. But I think even more than that, what we're going to see is a move away from these sort of analog adaptations and ways of thinking about books. So you no longer have books in browsers or digital magazines. You sort of explode the container, as others have mentioned earlier. And I'll just close with the thought that the story is what has been really persistent through human culture. In fact, it could be one of the most defining aspects of human culture is our compulsion to tell and share stories. And I think that's what will always continue. And it's life bound in pages or bound in even a container that can be referred to whether digitally or made of actual paper and cloth as a book. That's been an extremely brief history in the life of the story in human culture. So I think we're going to we are, I believe, kind of moving away from that. But stories will persist, and stories told now with the sort of full suite and array of media at our disposal to share in these, devices as they proliferate. And do I have time for questions? I do. So I don't know if there's any questions. Happy to take them. Going once.
The Twitter question is there anything on the Atlas we can read for free?
Oh, I can generate a coupon code for you when I get back to my seat. So we'll see if we can do a freebie for books and browsers. All right. Oh, I didn't shout out to the little people. Hello, little people. Goodbye, little people. Thank you all.